Hello and welcome to the latest Vega video. This video is concerned with Unit 1 and with the tail end of Unit 1, with the end of the Cold War. And we're going to start by answering the question above me. What was détente? Now détente very simply is a French word which means relaxation, but in historical terms we use this to refer to a period in which tension between the superpowers really eased. Usually when we think about détente we think about the 1970s. But it's important to recognise that relationships between the superpowers had been improving steadily throughout the 1960s, really after the high point in tension that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have a series of agreements between the USSR and the USA, starting with the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and culminating in the 68 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So these are two powers that were actually improving their relationship for a while before we get into détente proper. Now there were four major causes of détente, which you can see on the screen behind me. The first was to save money. Both the USA and the Soviet Union entered the 1970s with very considerable needs to save money. In the case of the USA, they had suffered significant debts as a result of the Vietnam War, which had been virtually crippling. And the Soviet economy, as we all know, had sputtered along for decades by this point, never really achieving any real competitive efficiency. Standards of living in the USSR remained significantly below those in the capitalist West, so anything that offered the opportunity to reduce defence spending would have been a good thing. The second thing was that, perversely, since the erection of the Berlin Wall, relations between the superpowers in Europe had actually improved. The wall had calmed tensions and had removed some of the source of concern that had acted as such a flashpoint throughout the 1940s and 50s, and had actually made Europe a more secure place. Finally, we also had the Sino-Soviet split, which was that as China became a more assertive power and was able to establish independent relations with countries like the USA, the Soviet Union was effectively forced to look for a different diplomatic strategy. So avoid being outflanked on its eastern flank, it had to essentially do a deal with the United States to make sure that its security was stronger in the West. And finally, there were genuinely increasing concerns about the threat of nuclear war. So this is the high point for movements such as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the West, where hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated in capital cities and major cities around the world against the possibility of nuclear war. Remember, mutually assured destruction had been a reality now since the late 1940s and early 1950s. We also have the very significant input of Richard Nixon, who had been a lifelong anti-communist. He'd been a figure very prominent in the McCarthyist movement, had advised the House Un-American Affairs Committee, if you remember that from a study of the US in the 1950s. And Americans essentially trusted him with the responsibility of doing a deal with the USSR because they felt very simply that he would never capitulate, that he would never give in, that he would be strong in the face of communist aggression. And he decided that because he had this credibility in the United States, he could do deals initially with Red China and eventually with the Soviet Union. And a critical part of that was something that he pronounced called the Nixon Doctrine. And the Nixon Doctrine is essentially a slight reversal of the Truman Doctrine. It means that America's allies, whilst they should still resist the encroachment of communism, should do so increasingly independently, so they shouldn't rely quite so heavily on the USA. And after all, as we all know, you're not a president of the United States for real unless you have a doctrine named after you. You can imagine them all getting together and comparing notes. Look at Eisenhower. He doesn't have a doctrine named after him. All he did was win World War II. What a loser. So, the first tangible sign of détente, the first major event that we need to understand for our end of the Cold War syllabus, is SALT I, or the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which were negotiated between 1969 and 1972. And they really produced three major agreements. The first was that the superpowers pledged to do their utmost to avoid military confrontation, so that they would work quite hard to avoid blowing up the world and turning the rest of us into crispy bits of toast. That was nice of them. The second was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited each superpower to 100 anti-ballistic missiles each. And finally, we've got the Interim Treaty which placed the limits on the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or those missiles that could fly between continents. And the USSR agreed to a limit of 1,618, and the USA to 1,054. and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, in which both agreed to a limit of 740. Now, the USSR got a better deal out of this than it seems like at first glance, because they had a significant lead in other areas of conventional warfare. So, allowing the US a slightly less large reduction seemed like a fairer deal. But the bad news about all this, although it was a step forward, was that this was mostly very old technology. It was a little bit like the makers of PlayStation and Xbox getting together and agreeing that they weren't going to market machines that they put together 5 years ago. The treaty didn't cover newer, multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, which continued to grow and which actually were much more significant parts of the US and the Soviet Union's arsenal during the 1970s. So whilst it was a step forward diplomatically, it didn't do a great deal to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons on both sides of this Cold War. Secondly, the second major agreement between the two powers was the Helsinki Accords of 1975. So these were a series of agreements between the superpowers which were essentially designed to improve peace and security in Europe. They were signed in Helsinki in Finland between now President Gerald Ford, who you can just see over my shoulder, and they were divided into three baskets. The first was an acceptance that the borders of European countries would not be altered by force. And this is significant because it's really the first time since 1945 that both superpowers agree on a stalemate in Europe, that nothing major is going to change as a result of anything either of them does. The second was it promoted trade and the exchange of technology. And this is particularly valuable to the Soviet Union because, of course, the Soviet economy is significantly behind the USA at this point and remains significantly behind the USA. So anything that they can do legitimately to get hold of technology from Western companies is a very positive thing for them. Finally, there was an agreement to respect human rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of movement across Europe. Now, most people think that the Soviet Union signed this essentially as a diplomatic sop to the USA and never really took it seriously. And there's some truth in that argument. It's certainly not the case that the human rights record of the Soviet Union improved dramatically after 1975. But one thing that the Helsinki Accords did do, and the agreement on human rights in particular, was to give encouragement to dissident groups, so those people inside the Soviet Union who were trying to resist oppression from above, and they often cited it as a reason for their continued resistance. Finally, if we skip forward to 1979, we have SALT II, so the second of the major agreements on arms limitations between the two superpowers, and this was supposed to replace SALT I, which was always an interim agreement. The proposal was to set equal limits on missile launchers and strategic bombs, except for cruise missiles, which was sort of the new wave, newfangled PS4 type missiles that the US had in place. Now, SALT II was opposed consistently by right-wing politicians in the USA who saw any form of arms control as a sort of trick which would allow the USSR to catch up with America. They were very conscious that their economy and their military was essentially better than the USSR. So why agree to any form of limitation which would ultimately simply serve the USSR better? In 1977, Carter tried to renegotiate SALT II to reduce the number of Soviet missiles, and they agreed precise figures in June of 1979, so a significant step forward by President Jimmy Carter. However, the agreement was effectively killed by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan of December of 1979. So Carter having signed SALT II, the Senate then refused to ratify it, which essentially means that they refused to agree to it. And if the Senate doesn't agree to foreign treaties like this one, it means that they can't be enforced. But the invasion of Afghanistan obviously gave fuel to the fire of those right-wingers in the United States who thought that it simply never would work and that this was a concession too far to the Soviet Union. And of course, the invasion also essentially brings Détente to an end. So this period of cooling tensions between the superpowers that characterises most of the 1960s and 70s have effectively ended by December of 1979 and certainly into 1980 when we start to think about a second Cold War.